Well, skyrocketing housing costs have many families in America living in a nightmare.
24's real estate market ended with increasing home prices and high mortgage rates.
For decades, the American dream used to be an assurance of being able to afford a nice home, a car, and a quality education. However, recently things have taken a turn for the worse. The United States is going through a massive housing crisis, and this crisis is mostly centered around the unavailability of homes in the largest cities of the country. The shortage of homes in metropolitan regions and the prices of the available homes clearly shows the true picture of the housing situation, which is going to be a much bigger problem for the federal administration in the coming months. When you come to think of it, the pandemic, inflation, and elevated interest rates have all contributed to the growing housing crisis in the U.S., but it's important to understand the crisis first. Defining the housing price crisis. Now, before moving on with the discussion, it's important to understand what a price crisis really means. The housing price crisis refers to the imbalance between home prices and average household incomes, making it quite difficult for an average American to purchase or even rent suitable housing. In many regions of the country, these skyrocketing costs have pushed home ownership beyond a possibly achievable reach, while renters too are facing unsustainable costs relative to their income. How bad is the situation actually? To get a better picture about the severity of the situation, let's take a look at some of the key statistics that'll further make the situation clear to you. So, according to the data collected from the National Association of Realtors, the median home price in the U.S. exponentially increased to $416,000 in the third quarter of 2023, compared to approximately $257,000 in 2013. Similarly, the rents across the majority of the cities have seen a staggering more than 18% increase between 2020 and 2023. The situation has become so alarming that nearly 49% of renters spent over 30% of their income on housing in 2022. Now, if the situation is so bad right now, then it's important to ask what actually led to this. Step-by-step factors leading to the crisis. Although this price crisis has received media attention in the past couple of years, it didn't happen in a year or two. All of this is actually a domino effect that started almost a decade and a half ago, and gradually the situation came to the crisis that we're dealing with today. Number 1. Historical context and market trends. Now, if you ask me, the present-day crisis can be traced back to the year 2008. We all know about the infamous 2008 housing crash. This crash completely decimated home values and led to a significant shift in the housing market. On one hand, this period forced millions of people into foreclosure, while on the other hand, seeing this as a business opportunity, many institutional investors entered the market. These investors purchased a large number of properties throughout the country at relatively low prices and converted them into commercial rental units. Slowly, this trend moved from bigger cities to smaller towns, and pretty soon, the availability of starter homes for individuals and families reduced. A couple of years after the crash, the market started to heal a bit, and from 2010 to 2020, housing prices rebounded due to steady economic growth and historically low mortgage rates. As a result, more and more people grew economically stronger to buy their own homes, but this time, as the demand grew, the housing supply did not keep pace, which ultimately led to price inflation. Number 2. The impact of COVID-19, 2020 to 2023. Before COVID happened, many youngsters across the country had started to believe that owning a home wasn't necessarily a priority. Especially the people living in bigger cities started preferring renting, but the trend suddenly changed during the pandemic. With lockdowns, most of the people were confined to their homes. Soon, most of the work shifted to remote working instead of on-site working, and suddenly everyone started seeing that living in a spacious suburban or rural home was much better than being confined to a small apartment in a big city. Obviously, this shift in the overall thinking further resulted in demand surge. Another notable thing that happened during this period was a decrease in mortgage rates. The Federal Reserve's pandemic-era policy of lowering interest rates to nearly zero started promoting cheap borrowing, In 2021, the average mortgage rate dropped to an all-time low of just 3%, which encouraged an unpredictable rush into the housing market. Now, one sector that COVID affected in the whole world were the supply chains. Because of lockdowns in the majority of the countries across the world and almost all of America, the supply chains of everything from a small nail to lumber and cement got disrupted. As a result, like every other thing, construction materials, including lumber, cement, and glass, saw sharp price increases. The situation was made worse due to labor shortages, which resulted in further price hikes, as well as long delays, thus further affecting the housing supply. Number 3. Supply constraints and underproduction. One of the most important factors in this domino effect has been the underproduction in the housing industry. Just like Canada and Britain, who are facing the same problem, America too failed to build the houses that were required to keep the demand and supply equation stable. Between 2010 and 2020, the U.S. built fewer homes per capita than in any decade since the 1960s. And believe me, this is way worse than it actually sounds. But the question that might come to your mind is, why do we build fewer homes? If we knew that the demand was increasing and the country was growing economically, then why weren't enough homes built for the coming generations? Well, one of the reasons is land shortage. And before you start arguing that there's plenty of land available outside your town, how can there be a land shortage? Let me explain this to you. You see, to build something on land, you need to have certain permission from the local government. These permissions are determined by the government land regulations, and these regulations vary from state to state and city to city. Now, these zoning laws in many urban areas, particularly in California, New York, and Texas, have really limited the availability of buildable land. Now, these laws often favor single-family homes over multifamily developments, but it has its cons too. Because of certain restrictions due to these laws, the commercial building of houses gets restricted, which results in a decreased housing density and price surge. Similarly, in many areas, the communities that are already present resist affordable housing projects because they think that such projects will decline the values of their properties and overburden the infrastructure. Number 4. Investors entering the market. In the 80s, 90s, and even early 2000s, the housing market's goal was simple: to provide a nice 2 to 3 bedroom house to an average middle-class American family. But is the goal of the market the same in 2024? Unfortunately, no. During the last decade, a lot of corporate investors, such as private equity firms and real estate investment trusts, or REITs, have entered the market, and the housing sector is essentially a business now that's working like Wall Street, where the only goal is profit, no matter how it comes. These big players are increasingly purchasing homes and converting into rentals. In 2022, institutional buyers accounted for 24% of single-family home sales, thus further decreasing the available inventory for traditional middle-class buyers. Similarly, platforms like Airbnb have caused property owners to convert long-term rentals into short-term vacation homes, which has reduced the rental availability. This trend is particularly heavy in areas that get a lot of tourists. Number 5. Rising interest rates. If the situation wasn't worse till now, the 2022 increase in interest rates certainly made it much, much worse. To combat increasing inflation, the Federal Reserve raised interest rates aggressively in 2022 and 2023. Mortgage rates climbed to over 7% in 2023, which, by the way, is the highest since 2002. As a result, these high borrowing costs pushed monthly mortgage payments out of reach for many buyers. For example, a 30-year mortgage for a $400,000 home at 3% interest costs around $1,686 per month. But at 7%, the payment jumped to $2,661, an increase of nearly 58%. I mean, even if you start working 2 jobs, how on earth can you afford this? Effects of the housing crisis. This crisis has led to a lot of negative effects, and some of them are getting worse over time. Number 1. Generational inequality. It's a known fact that you have a much lower chance of owning a house than your grandparents, and it doesn't matter if you're earning 10 times more than them. Millennials and Gen Z are facing an uphill battle to achieve homeownership, which, by the way, is considered a cornerstone of wealth building. In 2023, only 42% of millennials owned homes, compared to 50% of baby boomers at the same age. And by the looks of it, this difference will increase even further in coming years. Number 2. Rental market strain. If you're a working individual with a small family, your first preference would obviously be to own a home. But as we've already discussed, this is getting almost impossible today, so naturally, your second option would be to rent a home out. With homeownership getting unattainable for many, rental demands have surged, driving prices higher. The median rent in the U.S. reached $2,053 per month in 2023, creating affordability challenges for a lot of families. Number 3. Homelessness crisis. If you can't own a home and you can't run one either, then unfortunately you have no option but to become a homeless person. A couple of decades ago, you'd hardly see a homeless individual, especially if you lived in a smaller city or suburbs. But today, the situation is exactly the opposite and actually quite horrific. Rising costs have led to increases in homelessness, and an estimated 580,000 people were homeless in 2022, with many cities reporting higher encampment populations. Also remember that the actual number is much, much higher, as there's no proper records of most of the homeless population. Conclusion. The USA housing price crisis is a multifaceted issue, which has been caused because of a combination of historical underproduction, speculative investment, rising demand, and policy gaps. Addressing these crises requires a coordinated effort from federal, state, and local governments, as well as private sector engagement, and it will take a lot of time and a lot of effort.